The call came on a Friday afternoon in November, and Gary Holt knew before he picked up the phone that it was not going to be a good conversation. He knew because the number on the screen was Walt Dryer's cell, and Walt Dryer did not call the dealership on Friday afternoons unless something had already been decided. Walt called on Tuesday mornings when he needed parts. He called on Thursday afternoons when he wanted to schedule service. Friday afternoon calls from Walt Dryer were a different category of communication, and in 22 years of running the Holt family John Deere dealership in Finney County, Kansas, Gary had learned to read the timing of a customer's call the way a farmer reads the sky. Not always right, but rarely surprised when the thing he expected arrived. Walt said he was calling to let Gary know that he had signed a purchase agreement with the Massey Ferguson dealer in Garden City. 7 machines, 2 large row crop tractors, 3 mid-range utility units, and 2 specialty machines for his irrigated ground. He said he was trading in his current Deere fleet as part of the deal, and that he wanted Gary to know before the trade-ins were delivered, so there were no surprises. He said he appreciated the years of business and that the decision was not personal. Gary said he understood. He thanked Walt for calling directly. He asked if there was anything the dealership could have done differently. Walt said there were several things, and that he had been saying so for 3 years, and that he did not want to go through the list again now, because the decision was made and going through the list again served no purpose for either of them. Gary said that was fair. Walt said he was sorry it had ended this way. Gary said he was too. He hung up and sat in his office for a long time. Walter Dryer farmed 4,200 acres of corn, grain sorghum, and winter wheat in Finney County. He had been a Holt family John Deere customer for 18 years, since the year Gary's father had sold him his first new tractor, and Gary had been working the parts counter during summers in college. The Dryer operation was the dealership's single largest customer by revenue. Parts and service alone ran to approximately $180,000 annually. Equipment purchases, on a replacement cycle that had run 1 or 2 major units per year, had averaged another $140,000 per year over the previous decade. Gary had done the arithmetic so many times across the years that he did not need a calculator. The Dryer account was not simply the dealership's largest customer. It was the account whose margins helped cover the overhead that allowed the dealership to serve the smaller operations in the county that could not individually sustain a service department the size Gary ran. Losing Walt Dryer was not a business setback. It was a structural event. Gary did not go home that evening until he had written down every specific complaint Walt Dryer had raised in the previous 3 years. Not from memory, from the service records, from the notes his service manager kept after difficult customer conversations, from 2 emails Walt had sent to Gary directly that Gary had responded to with promises that had not been fully kept. He wrote them on a yellow legal pad in the same deliberate way his father had written things down when a problem required thinking through rather than reacting to. The list had 6 items. Parts lead times on critical components, 3 instances in the previous 2 years where Walt had waited more than 5 days for parts that the dealership's distributor had not stocked locally and had to source from a regional warehouse. On 2 of those occasions, the wait had affected field operations during a time-sensitive window. The third had been during winter maintenance and had been inconvenient but not costly. Loaner equipment. The dealership had eliminated its loaner tractor program 18 months earlier as a cost reduction measure following a difficult fiscal year. Walt had asked about loaner availability twice in the intervening period and had been told the program was suspended. Both requests had come during periods when his own equipment was in for service. Labor rate. The dealership's current rate was $118 per hour. The Massey Ferguson dealer in Garden City charged $94. Walt had mentioned the gap once in one of the emails, and Gary had explained the overhead structure that justified the Holt rate. Walt had not raised it again, which Gary had taken as acceptance and which Gary now understood had been something else entirely. Technician continuity. The dealership had lost 2 senior technicians in the previous 3 years, both to higher-paying positions at larger operations in western Kansas. The replacements were competent, but less experienced, with the specific quirks of older Deere iron that Walt's fleet included. Walt had mentioned this once at the parts counter, not to Gary but to the service writer, and the comment had been noted in the service records. Scheduling response time. The dealership's current booking window for non-emergency service had stretched to 4 weeks during peak season. Walt had experienced this twice in the previous year, once with a pre-season service request in March that had been booked for mid-April, and once with an end-of-season transmission concern that had been told to wait until December. The final item on the list was the one that Gary had known about and had not fixed, and knowing that he had known about it and had not fixed it was the part that sat with him the longest on that Friday evening in his office with the legal pad on the desk. Walt Dreyer had asked, in person and in writing, for a dedicated service contact, a single technician or service advisor who knew his operation and his equipment and who he could reach directly when something needed attention. Gary had agreed it was a reasonable request. He had said he would set it up. He had not set it up because the staffing situation had not been stable enough to commit a specific person to a specific customer without creating service equity problems with other accounts. And the months had gone by, and the commitment had remained uncommitted, and Walt Dreyer had noticed. Gary took the legal pad home. He sat at his kitchen table and looked at the 6 items for a long time. Then he turned the page over and began writing on the back. What he wrote was not a plan to win Walt Dreyer back. He was not certain that was possible, and he was not certain it was the right goal. What he wrote was a plan to ensure that the 6 items on the front of the page were never again the reason a customer left his dealership. Not Walt Dreyer. Not anyone. He worked on the plan through the weekend. The first decision was the loaner program. Gary had eliminated it to cut costs. The elimination had saved the dealership approximately $34,000 annually in insurance, maintenance, and depreciation on the loaner fleet. The Dreyer account alone had been worth $320,000 per year in combined parts, service, and equipment revenue. The arithmetic was not complicated. He called his equipment finance contact on Monday morning and began the process of acquiring 3 loaner units, 2 large utility tractors and 1 row crop tractor, through a structured arrangement that minimized upfront capital while providing the capacity the program required. The second decision was harder. The dealership needed a senior technician, not a competent recent hire. A technician with genuine depth on Deere iron, with the kind of diagnostic instinct that comes from years of working on machines in conditions that textbooks do not fully describe. Gary called 3 people he knew: a retired Deere technician in Garden City who had been out of the workforce for 2 years, a senior tech at a dealership in Dodge City who Gary had heard was dissatisfied with his current situation, and a man named Dale Ingram, who had worked for Holt Family John Deere for 11 years before leaving in 2019 for a position that had paid more and had turned out to be less satisfying than he had expected. Dale Ingram called back first. The conversation was careful on both sides. Dale had left on good terms and had stayed in contact with former colleagues at the dealership. He knew the operation's current situation without being told. Gary said he wanted to bring Dale back at a rate that reflected his seniority, with a defined customer account responsibility that would give him direct ownership of specific large accounts rather than the undifferentiated workload the dealership's current staffing model produced. Dale asked about the specific accounts. Gary said the Dreyer account was the primary one he had in mind, and that he was aware of the irony in that given the timing. Dale said he was aware of it too. He asked for a day to think about it. He called back the following morning and said yes. Parts availability was the most structurally complex problem on the list. Gary could not unilaterally change his distributor's stocking decisions. What he could do was change his own inventory position on the components that had caused the wait time problems, identify the specific parts that had been the source of the 3 critical delays Walt had experienced, and ensure those components were stocked at the dealership level rather than sourced on demand. He pulled the service records and identified the specific part numbers. He reviewed his inventory investment limits. He made the stocking adjustments. The carrying cost was real but bounded, and the alternative had demonstrated itself clearly enough that the carrying cost was not a difficult decision. The labor rate was the item Gary spent the most time on. His $108 rate reflected genuine overhead: the building, the equipment, the staffing, the insurance, the compliance costs that a full-service dealership carries. He was not going to match Garden City's $94. He was not sure that matching it was the right move, even if he could. But he could do something his dealership had never done. He could create a tiered service agreement structure for major accounts that provided a committed annual rate in exchange for a volume commitment, giving large customers predictability on their service costs while giving the dealership the account security that justified the rate discount. He had his accountant model it across 4 account sizes. The numbers worked at a rate that represented a meaningful discount from the rack rate without eliminating the margin the dealership needed. He had the service agreement drafted. 6 months after Walt Dreyer's Friday afternoon phone call, Gary Holt drove to the Dreyer operation on a Tuesday morning in May. He had not called ahead. He had considered calling ahead and had decided against it, because a phone call would give Walt the option of declining the meeting before Gary had the chance to show him what the meeting was about. He drove his pickup, not the dealership service truck. He brought the legal pad. Walt was in his yard when Gary pulled in. He had a Massey Ferguson 7S parked beside the shop and was talking to his hired man about something that involved the machine's front linkage. He saw Gary's truck and finished the conversation before he walked over. His expression was not unfriendly. It was the expression of a man who is mildly surprised and not certain yet how he feels about the surprise. Gary said he was sorry to drop in unannounced. Walt said it was his yard and he could come in it. Gary said he had driven out because he wanted to show Walt something rather than describe it over the phone, and that he would take 30 minutes of Walt's time if Walt was willing, and that if after 30 minutes Walt wanted him to leave, he would leave without further conversation. Walt said 30 minutes was fine. They went into the farm office. Gary put the legal pad on the desk, the side with the 6 items facing up. He said he wanted Walt to confirm that the list was accurate before he showed him the other side. Walt looked at the list. He read through the 6 items. He said the list was accurate and that it was also not complete, but that it captured the primary issues. Gary said he understood it was not complete and that he was not going to argue about the items that were not on it. He turned the page over. He walked Walt through each element of what the dealership had done in the 6 months since November. The loaner program, reinstated with 3 units now available and a 4th on order. Dale Ingram, rehired at senior technician rate with the Dreyer account listed in his service agreement as a primary responsibility. Gary produced the signed agreement with Dale's signature on it. The part stocking changes, documented by part number with current inventory levels. The service agreement structure, showing the annual rate for an account of Walt's size. Walt read through all of it without speaking. He asked one question about the loaner tractor specifications, and Gary answered it. Then Walt was quiet for a moment. He said he appreciated what Gary had done. He said it was more than he had expected, and more than most dealers would have done. He said the list on the front of the legal pad was accurate, and that if Gary had done these things 3 years ago, the conversation in November would not have happened. Gary said he knew that. He said he was not there to pretend otherwise. Walt said his Massey Ferguson fleet had been operational for 6 months. He said the machines were performing well. He said the Garden City dealer had maintained the service commitments they had made, and that the parts availability, so far, had been what they had promised. He said he had not had a reason to regret the switch. Gary said he had not expected Walt to have regrets in 6 months. He said he would not expect Walt to have regrets in 6 months, regardless of which decision he had made, because 6 months was not enough time to know whether a fleet decision had been right or wrong. Walt said that was a fair point. Gary said he was not asking Walt to come back. He said he was not in a position to ask Walt to come back, because the Massey Ferguson trade-in agreement had already been completed and Walt's Deere machines were already sold, and there was no practical mechanism for undoing what had been done. What he was asking was whether Walt would be willing, at the end of a full season on the new fleet, 12 months of operational data, a full harvest cycle, a complete service record from the Garden City dealer, to sit down and compare notes. Not to make a decision about switching back. Simply to compare notes, as two men who had known each other for 22 years and who both had an interest in understanding what the data actually showed. Walt looked at him for a moment. Then he said that was a reasonable request and that he would agree to it. Gary drove back to the dealership. He told his service manager and Dale Ingram what had happened. He said the dryer account was not coming back in the short term, and possibly not at all, and that they were going to run the rebuilt service operation the way it should have been run for the past several years and see what happened. Dale said that sounded right. The service manager said the loaner program alone had already produced 2 positive responses from other large accounts in the territory who had heard about it through the informal channels that move information in agricultural communities. Gary said that was something. The 12 months passed. The dryer operation ran its first full season on the Massey Ferguson fleet. Walt kept notes, as he always had: fuel consumption, service calls, parts availability, downtime, dealer response times. He had kept notes on his Deere equipment for 18 years. He kept them the same way on the new machines. Gary kept notes too. The rebuilt service operation produced measurable results across the dealership's full customer base. The loaner program was used 14 times in the first 12 months. Dale Ingram's diagnostic work on 3 difficult repair situations saved customers a combined total that Gary calculated and did not publicize, but was aware of. The tiered service agreements had been signed by 4 large accounts in the territory. The parts wait time issues had not recurred on any of the stocked components. The meeting between Gary and Walt happened in November, 12 months after the original phone call. Walt brought his notebook. Gary brought his. Walt's data showed a Massey Ferguson fleet that had performed within the range he had projected when he made the switch. Fuel consumption was favorable compared to his previous Deere fleet on comparable field work. The Garden City dealer had met its service response commitments on 3 out of 4 service calls. The 4th had been a parts delay of 6 days on a hydraulic component, shorter than the worst of the delays he had experienced with Holt family John Deere, longer than the Garden City dealer had promised. Walt had noted it without drama and had recorded the dealer's response to the complaint, which had been a service credit and an explanation of the supply chain situation that Walt had found credible. Gary listened to all of it without interrupting. When Walt finished, Gary said the data sounded like a reasonable first season for a new fleet in a new dealer relationship. Walt said he thought so. Gary asked if there was anything that had surprised him. Walt said the cab comfort on the larger Massey Ferguson units was better than he had expected. He said the transmission response was different from what he was accustomed to, but that he had adapted to it within the first month. He said Tyler, his hired man, had taken to the machines without difficulty. Gary said his own operation had had a different kind of year. He described what the rebuilt service program had produced: the loaner utilization, the reduction in parts wait times, the technician continuity that Dale's return had restored to the large accounts. He said the dealership had not replaced Walt Dryer's revenue. He said he did not expect to replace it quickly. What he had done was make the dealership into the operation it should have been before Walt left, and he was prepared to operate it that way regardless of whether Walt came back. Walt said that was a more honest statement than he had expected. Gary said he had learned some things in the previous 12 months about the difference between running a dealership and running a dealership well, and that the distinction had cost him his largest customer to become clear to him, and that he was not interested in pretending the cost had been anything other than what it was. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was not ready to make any decision about equipment. He said his current Massey Ferguson machines were in the early portion of their productive life and that there was no rational basis for a fleet decision for at least 3 more years. Gary said he understood that. Walt said that when the time came, he would talk to Gary before he talked to anyone else. Gary said that was all he was asking. They shook hands. Walt picked up his notebook, and Gary picked up his, and they walked out of the farm office into the late autumn air, the field stripped bare around the dryer operation, the equipment shed holding 7 Massey Ferguson machines that had not been there a year ago and would be there for years to come. Gary drove back to the dealership. He pulled in, parked, and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. He had not won the account back. He had not expected to win it back. What he had done was drive out to a farm on a Tuesday morning in May with a legal pad and 30 minutes of a man's time, and he had shown that man what 6 months of work looked like when a dealer took a customer's departure seriously enough to fix the things that had caused it. Whether that was enough, whether it would be enough, 3 years from now when Walt Dryer's fleet reached the point where a replacement conversation made sense, Gary did not know. He was not a man who spent much time on questions whose answers required waiting to find out. He went inside. He checked the service board. He asked his service manager how Dale's morning had gone. The service manager said Dale had diagnosed a fuel system problem on a 6M that 2 previous shops had missed and had the machine back to the customer by noon. Gary said that was good work. It was. It was the kind of work the dealership should have been doing all along, for every customer, without needing to lose the largest account in the territory to understand why it mattered. He knew that now. It had cost him $320,000 a year in revenue to learn it. He was not going to forget it. The auctioneer moved through the yard at a pace that suggested he had already mentally closed the sale before the bidding started. It was a dispersal auction, the kind that happens when a man dies without a succession plan and his estate needs to be liquidated in a single morning. The farm outside Liberal, Kansas had belonged to Earl Tatum, who had run a wheat and grain sorghum operation on leased ground for 31 years before a stroke took him in February. Earl had no children. His nearest relative was a nephew in Wichita who had not been to the farm in 11 years and who had hired an auction company to clear the equipment because the alternative was managing it himself. The nephew had set no reserves. He wanted the property empty and the proceeds in a check by Friday. The Massey Ferguson 5711 was the last significant piece of equipment in the yard. It had not been the last piece by accident. The auction company's ringman had looked at it the previous day during the preview and made a quiet professional assessment. Flood damage to the cab, seized engine, destroyed electrical system from what appeared to be a combination of moisture intrusion and rodent activity in the wiring harness. The hydraulic system had not been tested because the engine wouldn't turn over. The ringman had positioned the machine at the end of the auction order because he knew what happened when a crowd that had already spent its money watched a damaged tractor go across. The number would be low. Better to get there when the serious buyers had already loaded and left. By the time the auctioneer reached the 5711, the yard had thinned. The 2 John Deere tractors had sold in the first hour at prices that reflected strong demand and a competitive crowd. The tillage equipment had moved steadily. The grain handling items had drawn good numbers from local elevator operators who had made the drive specifically for them. What remained in the yard when the auctioneer pointed at the Massey Ferguson was a smaller group. The buyers who stayed to the end because the end was where the distressed equipment appeared, and distressed equipment was what they had come for. Walter Grubb had been at the back of that group since 9 o'clock. He was 66 years old. He had spent 40 years working in John Deere dealership service bays, the last 22 of them as a senior technician at a dealership in Meade County, Kansas, that had employed him until a corporate consolidation had eliminated his position 14 months earlier. The consolidation had been handled in the way that corporate consolidations of regional dealerships are typically handled, with paperwork, with HR language about workforce restructuring, and with a severance check that did not reflect 4 decades of accumulated mechanical knowledge walking out the door. Walter had taken the check, cleaned out his toolbox, and driven home to the property outside Liberal, where he had lived for 31 years and where his wife had already begun asking him what he was going to do with himself. He had not answered that question directly. He had built a shop addition onto the existing detached garage, 12 by 24 feet, heated, with a proper lift he had located through a dealer equipment liquidation and purchased for less than a quarter of its replacement cost. He had arranged his tools, which were substantial, along the walls with the precision of a man who has organized tools his entire working life. He had a workbench, a parts washer, a hydraulic press, and a set of diagnostic equipment that covered the major agricultural equipment platforms he had worked on across 4 decades. He had a laptop with service manual subscriptions, and he had, as of the auction morning in March, no particular plan for what came through the shop door. He had come to the Tatum dispersal because dispersal auctions are where a man who knows machinery and has limited capital finds the intersection of low price and high potential. Walter had attended 11 equipment auctions in the 14 months since his layoff. He had bought 3 machines, a used sprayer he had repaired and sold, a loader tractor he had sold to a neighbor, and a hay rake he had fixed and used himself. He had made money on 2 of the 3 and broken even on the 3rd. He was not operating at scale. He was operating at the pace of a man who is figuring out what comes next by doing it rather than by planning it. When the auctioneer reached the Massey Ferguson 5711, Walter moved forward from the back of the group. The auctioneer opened at 500. Nothing moved. He dropped to 400. One hand went up, Walter's. Nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around the yard with the practiced patience of a man who has sold equipment nobody wanted in front of crowds that had already left. He said 400 once, 400 twice. He said sold. Walter paid cash. He arranged transport through a neighbor with a flatbed. The machine was on his lot by 3 o'clock that afternoon. He did not start the inspection that day. He had learned across 40 years of dealership work that the worst time to assess a damaged machine is immediately after acquiring it, when the mind is still running the acquisition math and the eyes are looking for confirmation rather than information. He covered the machine with a tarp, went inside, had supper with his wife, and watched the evening news. The next morning he went to the shop at 7 o'clock with a fresh notebook and began. The cab flood damage was the first thing he documented, systematically, panel by panel. The headliner had deteriorated. The seat was destroyed. The instrument cluster had visible corrosion on the connector pins. The wiring harness through the cab showed rodent damage at 3 locations. Chewed insulation, compromised conductors, one section where the damage was severe enough that replacement rather than repair was the correct approach. He pulled the section and measured it and wrote down the part number. The engine seizure was the critical question, and he approached it the way he approached every critical question, with the assumption that the answer was not yet known and that the path to knowing it required removing enough material to see clearly. He pulled the valve cover first. What he found was not what flood damage typically produces. The engine had not hydrolocked from water intrusion, a failure mode that usually means a destroyed engine, bent rods, cracked block. What he found was an engine that had seized from oil starvation. The oil was present but badly degraded, the kind of degradation that happens when a machine sits for an extended period after a final run with contaminated oil, and the oil film on critical bearing surfaces breaks down over time until the surfaces contact each other and seize. The damage was to the main bearings. The crankshaft had spun a bearing on the number 3 journal. The bore was intact. The heads were intact. The block was intact. Walter sat on his shop stool and looked at the engine for a while. A spun bearing on a seized engine sounds like a totaled engine to most people who hear those words. To a man who has rebuilt agricultural diesel engines across 40 years in service bays, it is a different conversation. The crankshaft would need to go out for grinding. The journal surface was damaged and had to be brought back to a precise dimension before an undersized bearing set could be installed. That was machine work he would send out. The rest of the rebuild was in his hands. He had the tools, the service data, the parts knowledge, and the patience. He did not have urgency, which was the most valuable thing a man rebuilding a seized engine can possess. He called a machine shop in Liberal he had used for dealership work over the years. The shop quoted $340 for the crankshaft grinding. Walter sourced the undersized bearing set himself from a supplier in Wichita, $220 for the full set, correct specification for the ground journals. He pulled the engine down over the weekend, extracted the crankshaft Monday, had it back from the machine shop Wednesday. He assembled the bottom end with the attention to clearance and torque specification that 40 years of this work had made automatic. He started the engine on a Thursday morning. It ran rough for 40 seconds while oil pressure built and the new bearings seated. Then it smoothed. He ran it for an hour at varying RPM, listening for bearing distress. He heard nothing that concerned him. The engine had cost him $560 in parts and machine work and 11 days of his own labor. The electrical repair took 4 more days. The cab wiring harness section that had been destroyed by rodents was a sourced replacement, $340 from a supplier who stocked MFD711 components. The instrument cluster connector pins cleaned with electrical contact cleaner and showed continuity after cleaning. The cab panels and headliner he sourced from a parts machine he located through an online agricultural equipment listing. A 5711 with a destroyed drivetrain and an intact cab located in Oklahoma, whose owner sold him the interior components for $180, including the seat. Walter drove to Oklahoma on a Saturday and was back by Sunday afternoon. The hydraulic system, which he had not been able to test before the auction, turned out to be the best news of the entire project. No damage. The pump tested within specification. The cylinders extended and retracted correctly. The system had been better protected from the conditions that had damaged everything else, by the geometry of the machine and by what appeared to be a functioning cab seal that had failed from the top but held from below. Total parts expenditure to bring the Massey Ferguson 5711 to full operational condition, $1,760. The auction price, $400. Total investment, $2,160, plus Walter's labor, which he was not counting as a cost because the alternative to spending that time in his shop was spending it not in his shop, which was not an alternative he found appealing. He drove the machine out of the shop on a Tuesday morning in early May. The MF5711 ran cleanly. The hydraulics responded correctly. The cab was dry, the instruments functional, the seat new. Walter ran it across his lot and back and shut it down and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he called a farmer he had known for 20 years, a man named Don Perkins, who ran a wheat operation 12 miles south and who had mentioned at a co-op meeting the previous fall that he was in the market for a utility tractor. Don came over that afternoon. He walked around the machine. He asked what had been wrong with it. Walter told him, in the same complete and direct way he had documented everything, what the auction condition had been, what he had found, and what he had done. Don asked what Walter wanted for it. Walter said $22,500. Don said that was fair. He asked if he could bring it back if anything surfaced in the first 30 days. Walter said yes. Don wrote the check. The machine never came back. What came back, starting 2 weeks after Don drove the 5711 home, was Don's neighbor, who had heard the story and had an MF6S with a hydraulic issue he couldn't get the regional dealer to schedule. Then Don's neighbor's brother-in-law with a different machine and a different problem. Then a farmer from 2 counties over who had driven past the dealer in Liberal without stopping and followed directions to Walter's shop from a man at the grain elevator who had heard from Don's neighbor that there was a retired Deere technician outside Liberal who could work on Massey Ferguson equipment at rates that made sense. Walter had not planned to work on other people's equipment. He had planned to find machines at auction, restore them, and sell them. The first machine had sold cleanly and profitably. The second machine he bought, a flood-damaged MF6S he located at an estate sale in Comanche County for $600, was sitting in his shop awaiting inspection when the neighbor's call came in. Walter did both. He worked on the neighbor's machine and he assessed the 6S. He found in that combination something he had not expected to find in retirement, the same satisfaction he had gotten from the best years of dealership work, without the scheduling pressure, the upsell requirements, the corporate efficiency metrics, and the documentation overhead that the dealership had built around every hour of shop time in the last decade before the consolidation. The work was the same. The conditions were different. The conditions were better. By the end of the first full year operating from his shop, Walter had restored and sold 4 machines and had taken in repair work from 19 farms across 3 counties. He had not advertised. He had a handwritten sign at the end of his driveway that said Farm Equipment Repair and a phone number. Every customer who called had been sent by someone else who had called before them. Walter kept a notebook of every job: machine, problem, diagnosis, parts, labor hours, charge. He kept the notebook the same way he had kept service records at the dealership, with the same level of completeness, because a man who has spent 40 years creating the documentation that protects both the shop and the customer does not abandon the practice when the shop is his own. The notebook at the end of the first year showed $78,000 in revenue across repair work and machine sales combined. Walter had expected less. He was not disappointed by more. He was thoughtful about it in the way he was thoughtful about engine clearances. Precisely, without excitement, focused on what the number meant rather than how it felt. What it meant was that the demand was real and the service gap was real, and his position at the intersection of 40 years of mechanical knowledge and a regional dealer network that could not serve the smaller and older end of the market at prices those customers could sustain was not an accident. It was a structural condition. It had existed before Walter arrived at his shop. It would exist after. He had not created the gap. He was filling it, the way a man fills any gap that his specific capabilities are suited to fill, without drama and without a business plan, one machine at a time. The second year came in at $112,000. Walter hired his first help, a part-time arrangement with a young man named Curtis Hale, who had grown up on a farm in Kiowa County and had 2 years of vocational agricultural mechanics behind him. Curtis worked 3 days a week. Walter paid him fairly and taught him the way he had been taught at the beginning of his own career, by doing the work beside him, explaining what he was looking at and why, letting Curtis make the diagnosis and then checking it. By the end of the second year, Curtis was working 5 days a week and handling straightforward repairs independently, while Walter handled the diagnostic work that required depth of experience. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer in Liberal had heard about Walter's shop by the end of the first year, through the same channels that all such information travels in agricultural communities. A customer mention, a service inquiry that referenced Walter's name, a pattern in the dealer's work orders suggesting that a category of customers had stopped appearing. The dealer's service manager drove past Walter's property without stopping, which Walter's wife observed from the kitchen window and reported to Walter without editorial comment. Walter said he expected that. His wife said she supposed so. The dealer principal called in the spring of the second year. He asked Walter if he was interested in a conversation about an authorized service relationship. Walter said he was willing to have the conversation. The dealer principal described the authorization requirements, training certification, tooling requirements, parts procurement through authorized channels, labor rate minimums that the manufacturer required for warranty reimbursement. Walter listened to all of it and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the authorized labor rate minimum was above or below his current rate. The dealer principal said it was above his current rate. Walter said that meant he would have to charge his customers more to comply with the authorization. The dealer principal said the authorization would bring warranty work that offset the rate increase. Walter asked what percentage of his current work involved machines under warranty. There was a pause. The dealer principal said he understood the situation. Walter said he appreciated the call. He did not pursue the authorization. What the conversation confirmed, in a way that Walter had suspected but not fully articulated, was that the authorization structure served manufacturers and dealers in ways that were not identical to the ways it served farmers, particularly the farmers who were his customers, who ran older machines, who were past warranty, who needed competent work at rates that reflected the economics of operations that were not large. The authorization would have changed what he was. He had spent 40 years being what the dealership needed him to be. He was not interested in spending the next portion of his working life being what the manufacturer's authorization required. He went back to the shop and got on with it. By the end of the third year, Walter's shop had generated $142,000 in annual revenue. He had Curtis full-time and had added a part-time arrangement with a retired farmer named Arlen Beck. No mechanical certification, but 40 years of practical knowledge about how agricultural equipment fails in field conditions. That is a different kind of knowledge from service manual knowledge, and equally important to a shop that is diagnosing problems rather than simply executing prescribed repairs. Arlen worked 2 days a week and was worth considerably more than 2 days of his time suggested. The Massey Ferguson 5711 that Walter had bought for $400 was not in his shop anymore. It was working ground 12 miles south on Don Perkins' operation, accumulating hours the way properly maintained machines accumulate hours, steadily, without drama, in the service of a man who knew what he had paid for it and trusted that the work behind it was sound. Walter occasionally saw it when he drove past the Perkins place on his way to a service call in the southern part of the county. He did not stop. There was no reason to stop. The machine was running. His work was done. What had not been done, and would not be done for as long as Walter chose to keep working, was the larger project of filling a service gap that had existed before him and would require his continued presence to remain filled. The farmers who called him were not calling a business. They were calling a man, a specific man with a specific history and 40 years of knowledge that could not be replicated by a sign at the end of a driveway. The reputation was personal, built on the credibility of a man who told you what was wrong with your machine and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing, and who had been right enough times that the question of whether he was right this time did not need asking. By the time the third year closed, and Walter sat with the notebook and the spreadsheet his daughter had built him, and the full picture of what the operation had become, the cumulative 3-year revenue stood at $332,000. He did not celebrate the number, he noted it. He filed the notebook in the cabinet above the workbench beside the 2 notebooks that had preceded it. He wrote the year and the total on the spine in black marker, the same way he had labeled service records at the dealership for 40 years. Then he went to an estate auction in Comanche County, where a Massey Ferguson 7S with a destroyed transmission and a sound engine was listed without reserve, and he sat in the back of the crowd while the auctioneer worked through the morning's equipment and waited for the number to get low enough that the math worked in his direction. It did. It always did. For a man who knew what a machine was worth when other people were deciding it was worth nothing. The dealership consolidation that had handed Walter a severance check and cleaned out his toolbox had made a calculation about what 40 years of mechanical knowledge cost to carry on a balance sheet. The calculation had concluded that the cost was too high and that the knowledge could be replaced by the efficiencies that consolidation was supposed to produce. The farms that drove past the consolidated dealership on their way to Walter's shop were the answer to that calculation. They were not a verdict on the dealership. They were a market condition, the natural consequence of a service gap that appeared when the structure built to fill it was reorganized around priorities other than filling it. Walter had not sought the gap. He had simply been the person available to fill it, with the tools and the knowledge and the time and the lack of any particular reason not to. He had paid $400 for the machine that started it. The machine was running 12 miles south, doing the work it was built to do, on a farm whose operator had paid a fair price for it and received a sound machine in return. The man who had restored it was in his shop on a Tuesday morning, with 2 mechanics working beside him and a line of equipment outside that represented 30 farms across 3 counties that had decided his address was the right answer to the question of where to take a machine that needed attention. The auctioneer had called it sold for $400. Walter had decided it was worth considerably more than that. 3 years later, the numbers agreed with him completely.